Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our reading through the Gospel of Luke, and this is our part 2 video slash podcast series about Luke 11 to Luke 20. Now, if you've been following along, if you've been reading through some of the material that we've provided, I'm so glad that you have been. And as you can tell, there's so much within the Gospel of Luke and within 9 and 10 chapters that I can't cover all of it. There's volumes and volumes of stuff in the Gospels, and as you can tell, you can see many of these books are some of those volumes. So I can't deal with all of the things in the study, and I can't deal with all of the things in a video that you and I are a part of today. But I do want to focus on one particular thing today, one particular chapter in Luke, and we're going to focus on Luke chapter 15. And Luke chapter 15 is a story of 3 different parables that Jesus told the Pharisees when they asked him a question. And I love parables. If there's one kind of thing I love, it's stories. And stories draw me in. Even my wife jokes around with me and says when we start watching a TV show that I just get drawn in and I can't let it go. I want to know what happens. And you and I'm sure you have the same experience. We are drawn in by these stories, and they teach us things not explicitly, but sometimes implicitly. If somebody tells you to do something, you might not do it, or if somebody tells you not to do something, you might not do that. But if somebody tells you a story that implicitly says maybe that thing or this thing, you might make that decision to do this thing or that thing yourself. And I love when Jesus teaches with parables. And the second reason I love Jesus teaching in parables is that there's no right or wrong way to interpret a parable if it's in the way of love. That you might read a parable today and you might take it in one direction, and you might read a parable 10 years from now and you might take it in a different direction. And your neighbor across the street might read it the same day, and they're going to take it in a different direction. And all of those things are good because that's the way parables speak. That's the way we trust that Spirit is speaking to us through these stories that Jesus told his disciples and the Pharisees a long time ago. And the third reason I like it is that a story and a parable invites you into the story. You get to figure out where you find yourself. What character do you resonate with most? What character do you despise the most? What character brings up the most drama for you? And it invites you into the story and to resonate with the characters. So what I'm going to do for us is I'm going to read these 3 parables and kind of stop a couple times and highlight a few things and then just kind of talk about them for a little bit. So if you want to follow along, it's Luke chapter 15, and I'm going to read the whole chapter, and this is from the CEB version. So all the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." The Pharisees and tax collectors and Pharisees and the legal experts, they're not too thrilled about Jesus with these sinners and tax collectors. And I love the way in which Jesus answers a question, because he never answers a question straight up. He always answers a question with a question or answers a question with a story. And this time, Jesus tells them a parable. He says, "Suppose someone among you had 100 sheep and lost one of them. Wouldn't he leave the other 99 in the pasture and search for the lost one until he finds it? And when he finds it, he is thrilled and places it on his shoulders?" Now, many of us have heard this story where you lose the one, you go and find the one and leave the 99. Yet sometimes we forget the ending of the story, and I think it's really important. When he arrives home, he calls together all of his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Celebrate with me, because I found my lost sheep." In the same way, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who changes both heart and life than over 99 righteous people who have no need to change their hearts and lives. So that's the end of the first story. And then we have a second story right after that. "Or what woman, if she owns 10 silver coins and loses one of them, won't light a lamp and sweep the house, searching her home carefully until she finds it? When she finds it," again, this is the second half of the story, "she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, 'Celebrate with me, because I've found my lost coin.' In the same way, I tell you, joy breaks out in the presence of God's angels over one sinner who changes both heart and life. And that's the end of the second story. So we've got the lost sheep. They find the sheep, and then they have a party. They celebrate. And then we have the lost coin. They find the lost coin, and the neighbors are invited over, and they have a party, and they celebrate. And then we have a really famous parable. Now, oftentimes we call this the parable of the prodigal son, but the way in which you title it kind of shapes how you understand the text. So if you say the parable of the prodigal son, you almost always focus on the prodigal son. But I would call this the parable of the two brothers, because there's a second part of the story. This is what Jesus says. A certain man had two sons. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. When he had used up his resources, a severe food shortage arose in the country, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from what the pigs ate, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hands have hired more than enough food, but I'm starving to death? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me on as one of your hired hands.' So he got up and went to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. His father ran to him, hugged him, and kissed him. Then his son said, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting. Because this son of mine was dead and he has come back to life. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." So you can see the themes that we have here: the lost coin, the lost sheep, and now the lost son. And when we hear this story, we oftentimes sit with that. But there's more intricacies that we see at the end of this parable. Now, the older son was in the field. Coming in from the field, he approached the house and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant replied, "Your brother has arrived, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf and didn't want to enter in." Now, the older son was furious and didn't want to enter in, but his father came out and begged him. He answered his father, "Look, I've served you all these years, and I've never disobeyed your instruction. Yet you've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours returned after gobbling up your estate on prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him." Then his father said, "Son, you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is now alive. He is lost and is now found." And that's how this story ends. Now, I love these parables. Again, because there's so many different ways in which we can take them. And how I was always told of these parables is we celebrate for those lost who are now found. And I think that's a really, really important part of this parable, of these three parables. Yet, if I look back to what was going on in the front half, I think there's something else that we learn. We know the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the legal experts, they were grumbling because this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And they did not want to enter into that party, a party with sinners and tax collectors, because they're dirty. And they don't think they deserve it. And we have these three parables about the lost who were found. And it's really interesting to me that in all three of them, there's a form of celebration. There's a form of celebrating the lost son, a form of celebrating the lost coin. There's a form of celebrating the lost sheep. And all of the neighbors in the town celebrate with those lost things being found. And when I read this passage, I sometimes resonate with the Pharisees, with the legal experts, and with the older brother. Because let's be honest, sometimes those individuals who don't deserve it, why should they get all the nice things? I mean, when you have one of your best friends who gets the newest iPhone 12, and and kind of grumble in your heart, well, they always waste their money on those frivolous things. And there's some sort of resentment, there's some sort of thing that builds up that you hold some envy or jealousy towards that person. Or maybe you might recognize this when you take a test and you have somebody in the class that never studies, but they get a better grade than you do, yet you spent 4 hours studying the night before, using flashcards over and over again, yet that person gets a better grade than you do. How dare them? And again, that resentment begins to build and to build. Or maybe you look out and you see that there are these really big houses outside of your neighborhood. And you say, why can't I have that? I've done everything right. I have followed the rules. I have worked for this company for 32 years, and I don't have that thing. Yeah, see, it's so easy to be envious. It's so easy to be jealous of the other person that has other things. Yet when we do that, sometimes we would probably equate ourselves to the Pharisees and the legal experts and the older brother. Because the older brother thought he deserved everything. Yet what the Father does is the Father invites the older brother into the party. And we don't know what happens, but I'd like to think that the older brother would leave behind some of that resentment, leave behind some of that envy, leave behind some of that comparison. And I would hope that he would enter into that party. Because why wouldn't we celebrate with the son that was found? Why wouldn't we celebrate with our friend that has the newest iPhone? Why wouldn't we celebrate with our classmate who got a really good grade? Why wouldn't we celebrate with that friend that has that really nice house that we can have a party at? Yeah, why wouldn't we? Now there's an old Jewish story of a farmer who was farming, and God appeared to this farmer. And he was a little freaked out at first, but God says, no, don't be afraid. I'm here to give you 3 wishes. And the farmer says, oh, this is fantastic. And God says, well, I'll give you 3 wishes, but on the condition that whatever I give to you, I double what your neighbor has. And the farmer says, okay, that's fine. So the farmer thinks and he says, well, I'd like 100 cattle. And God says, okay, done. And 100 cattle appear on the farmer's property. And the farmer shouts with excitement and joy. He says, oh, this is 100 cattle I've never had. But then he notices in the periphery of his eye that he sees that his neighbor has 200 cattle. And he gets upset and frustrated. But he goes back to God and he says, God, I have my second wish, right? He said, yes, you do. And he says, well, I'd like 100 acres of land. And God says, okay, done. And he gives him 100 acres of land. And he says, oh, this is fantastic. I have 100 acres of land. But then he looks next door and he realizes his neighbor has 200 acres of land. And he gets furious. So he sits and he thinks with resentment building up. And he goes back to God and he says, God, I know my third wish. He said, okay, what is it? He said, I'd like you to blind me in one eye. And then God weeps. And that story. Oh, I know. That comparison, that envy, that jealousy. It removes all the celebration. It removes all the joy. So for you and for me, what are the ways in which we are invited to enter into the party? Will we choose to be the legal experts and the Pharisees and to grumble? Or will we choose to enter into the party and to celebrate because God has given us all that we have?